Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today and joining me in this short lecture titled Inequality in Long-Term Perspective. And I'll be looking at this issue of inequality in human societies from an archaeological perspective. And just to give you some brief background about myself, my name is Christopher Hernandez. I got my PhD from Northwestern University in 2017, and I'm currently an adjunct research associate at the University of Illinois Chicago and an instructor at Alamo College. And a little fun fact, I actually grew up 2 miles north of campus in Rogers Park. So I'm a Chicago native. I'm fairly familiar with the Loyola University and the campus. And hopefully once this pandemic is over, we can meet each other in person and we can share more of these conversations. So with that being said, let's get into the material for today. So today's lecture, I have two objectives. So the first objective is to describe the processes that led to the growth of inequality in the past. And two, to explain how archaeological research can address contemporary issues of inequality. You're going to want to take a moment to remember these two objectives because these are the threads that are going to unite everything that I'm going to be talking about for the next 20 minutes. Okay, next slide. So, inequality, it's kind of a big deal. It's all over the news. It's something that people are constantly talking about. It was an important part of the recent elections that just happened, are still at the heart of conversations that we're having today. So thinking about the pandemic and just all the hardships that it's brought on people. And yet you have certain companies, certain people like Jeff Bezos and the owner of SpaceX who are just making tons and tons of money while millions of Americans are struggling to pay rent, to find work, to get groceries, and we're thinking about how to stimulate the economy through perhaps checks and other types of stimulus in order to get things moving for the everyday US citizen. And the recent presidential elections, there was a strong focus on wealth gaps, thinking about wealth gaps in terms of race, sex, gender, many different factors. And these are huge, huge topics. So how do we address the kinds of inequality that we're seeing in our society in which the rich keep getting richer and it seems like the poor are getting poorer and the middle class seems to have stagnated and is dwindling perhaps? Well, my claim here is that archaeology has some very important things to say. And first of all, you might be thinking, what is this guy talking about? How does archaeology fit into these massive debates that we're having today? Or perhaps at an even more basic level, you're thinking, what is archaeology? What's he talking about? I don't know what that means. So I want you to take a moment here, about 15 seconds, pause, and envision an archaeologist. What are you seeing right now? And hold that image of an archaeologist. Was it anything like the images on the screen right now? Perhaps many of you immediately turn to this Indiana Jones type of figure, this fellow who's running around fighting Nazis, finding lost relics, not actually doing archaeology, but probably looking really cool in the process. And as a little side note, I don't know why Indiana Jones carries a whip. He fights Nazis. They're all running around with guns. Whip's not very useful in a gunfight. I don't know. I have to talk to the screenwriter or Steven Spielberg one day if you get a chance and ask him why Indiana Jones carries a whip. But tangents aside, some people might think of archaeologists as excavating pyramids and looking at the pharaohs in ancient Egypt. And there is some truth to that. Some archaeologists do this work. Others may think that we look at dinosaurs. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we archaeologists do not specialize in the study of dinosaurs. Sometimes we find dinosaur skeletons during our excavations, but that's not our area of specialty. We focus on people and the history of humanity. Dinosaurs, that's a different field, that's paleontology. For those of you who are gamers, maybe you thought of Lara Croft, Tomb Raider. Now we're getting some gender representation here. But the reality is closer to the last two images. So the image where you see a group of people together, we archaeologists work in teams, we work in groups. We often take funny pictures, but generally speaking, our work is focused in the dirt, looking for items that might be buried that'll help us learn about the human past and different social organizations and different things such as inequality. So we archaeologists have a lot to say about inequality. And when I'm talking about this, what I mean is differences in status, wealth, and power. So when we no longer see equal relationships in terms of status, wealth, and power, that's inequality. That's what I'll be talking about today. And then more broadly, thinking about, is inequality a natural part of life? So given the way that the world is today and all the conversations that we're having about the middle class and the super rich and the poor, you may be wondering, has it always been this way? Have humans always lived with these massive wealth gaps? And this is one of the major contributions that archaeologists and anthropologists more generally have made to the study of humanity in this question of inequality. Because we have this long-term perspective. We can study inequality decades, centuries, millennia ago, or even go back millions of years to when humans first evolved, and study anywhere along that time period to think about what human social organization was like during those times. And what we found is that really only up until about 12,000 years ago, we lived as mobile foragers, more popularly known as hunter-gatherers. Although those terms should be flipped because we actually relied more on gathering than we did on hunting. And so thinking about this type of lifestyle, this mobile, living off the land kind of lifestyle, begs questions about how social organization is tied to this way of living and what we can learn about how we existed for most of our history. And to do this, we turn to analogy. We look to different cases that can help us develop hypotheses and fill in gaps that we just can't interpret by only looking at material remains alone. And one example that I'll look at today is ethnographic analogy. So the Kungsan of the Kalahari Desert are an example that many people look to kind of interpret what life was like for humans back when we were primarily hunters and gatherers. Because the Kungsan, from when anthropologists first started to document them, they lived a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They lived out in the desert, out in the southern part of the African continent, and you can see the landscape in which they lived. You can see it's all dry desert, and they're roaming around looking for food and subsistence and living in this way that we evolved in. Now, it's not a direct analogy. It's not to say that the Kung directly represent what we look like in our evolutionary past. They just provide some clues that can then help us piece together hypotheses that we can then test via the archaeological record. But they are by no means sort of the last remnants of our evolutionary past. They're still here with us in the world today, dealing with many of the same conditions that we're dealing with, these issues of inequality, modernization, and ultimately global climate change as well. And so the story that I'm going to tell you about right now to illustrate a point about how society works among hunter-gatherers is the story of Christmas in the Kalahari Desert among the Kungsan, which is told by Richard Lee, an anthropologist. And he spent a lot of time with the Kung studying subsistence patterns and evolutionary histories and evolutionary questions. And an interesting thing happened when he tried to celebrate Christmas with the Kung by buying an ox that would then be slaughtered for a festival. So the Kungsan melded their December ritual of slaughtering an ox with Christmas that was brought in by European colonizers. They fit nicely in terms of time, and then the Kung adapted it to say, well, we're slaughtering this ox in order to honor the god chief, the birth of the Christian or the European god chief. And so the reason that Lee did this, the reason that he was buying an ox is because he felt bad. He felt bad that while he was working, he had all these materials, the canned goods, tools, lots of things that the Kung wanted, and were constantly asking him for it. Give me this, give me that, or exchange this for that. And sometimes he would do it, but generally speaking, he wouldn't give away most of his materials, either because they were asking for too much or because he wanted to set boundaries and make sure that he had food and other things that he would need for the future. But as he's about to leave for the field, he's feeling kind of guilty, and he says, I'm going to give back to the local community by buying this big, fat, juicy ox, this huge beast that I found, and it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful feast. Everyone's going to eat so much meat, and it's going to be great. It'll be a way of giving back to the local community. But once he buys the ox, the story takes a sudden turn of events. Because once the rest of the members of the community find out that he's bought this ox, they ask him about it. They say, we heard that you bought this ox. Is it true? And he says, yeah, that's true. I bought it. And they say, oh no, what have you done? Why have you gone and bought this scrawny, ugly, no good ox? He's not going to provide enough meat, and this was a horrible decision. Lee is just dumbfounded. This is his research. He studies human subsistence, and he looked at the ox and he saw that it was a really good creature that would provide lots of meat. And the Kung San are telling him, no, you've made a horrible decision. This is the worst thing you could have bought. It's scrawny. People are not going to get the food that they want. There's not going to be enough meat. Fights are going to break out. This is going to be a disaster. And Lee has no idea what to do, and they just bombard him with these comments and critiques about the ox and just how pitiful the creature is. And after a while, he just gets frustrated. He says, I'm done with it. He gives them the ox and leaves. But curiosity gets the better of him. Being an anthropologist, he wants to learn more. What just happened here? What's going on? Why are they telling me all these things? And so he comes back, they slaughter the ox, and he sees that it is amazing. It's everything he thought it was. Packed full of meat, packed full of fat, which is really what the Kung San tell him they wanted. The fat is the best part of the animal, and there's tons of it. And all the members of the community get all the meat that they want, and they're feasting for days. So once it's all over, Lee goes up and talks to some of his most trusted friends in the community. He says, why was everyone telling me that this ox was no good? They slaughtered it, and it was amazing. We had quite a barbecue, quite a feast. Everyone fattened up. I don't appreciate what they did. And the members of the community who he told this to kind of gave him a look. They said, so you were really offended by that, weren't you? Yes, he says, I was, of course. They're making fun of my ox. And they say, well, that's just the way that the Kung San are. That's just the way that we do things. Have you not noticed? And then Lee, of course, is listening now. Where's this going? And his local colleagues tell him, well, look at the way that they talk about and deal with hunts. Whenever a member of the community goes out, hunts, and actually kills or captures something, they don't come back in the community and start bragging about it. They don't start telling people, I've caught this huge, massive, or I've caught this great animal that'll feed so many people. They do it with humility. And in many ways, they're self-deprecating. They'll come in quietly, sit by the fire, look all meek and quiet. And when somebody comes up to them and asks them, so how did your hunt go? They'll say, it didn't go that well. I mean, I caught something, but it's meager. It's a bag of bones. We might be able to cook the bones and make some soup, but it's really not much. And that's how the rest of the community knows that this person has really got something and they're going to have meat for dinner. But that's the way it's supposed to be done, with humility, and you're not supposed to brag about it. So then Lee's, well, why? Trying to wrap his mind around it, and the others tell him, because we don't want anybody getting too full of themselves. We don't want anyone to think they're our chief. So when all the young men go out, if they're really good hunters and bringing in lots of meat, that could go to their heads. And if that starts to happen, then the rest of the community is ready to start ridiculing that individual to bring them down a peg. And so an example you could think of in your own lives is if one of your friends suddenly thinks they're a big shot and they show up and they say, hey, look at my new Jordans. Aren't they amazing? I'm the best. I'm amazing. and all of a sudden the rest of you say, let's bring this person down a peg, and you start ridiculing that person's shoes and saying, your shoes are dirty, they're scuffed, they're bent, no, get out of here. It's the same thing among the San, but they take it to another level. For them, it's an integral mechanism of their society to use this ridicule to make sure that everyone stays basically equal. No one person thinks they're better than the others. If anybody accumulates more wealth, then you can go and ask and take it, and so that everyone basically stays the same, and they live in what's called an egalitarian lifestyle. There are no real major differences in terms of wealth, status, and power among the individuals of the community. There are some, but nothing major, and anything kind of power or status that is acquired over a lifetime gets lost once that person passes away. They cannot give it to their children or any kind of heir. And so this begs the question, given the analogy of the Kongsan and what we understand about hunter-gatherers archaeologically speaking, they were a lot like this. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived a fairly egalitarian lifestyle and likely had the same mechanisms of maintaining social balance, of ridicule and other factors in order to keep everyone equal. And so we lived this way for millions of years. And really only up until about 12,000 years, our hunter-gatherer ancestors started to develop inequality, develop new ways of life, such as farming, which allowed for surplus and allowed for massive accumulations of wealth, and got us to the point where we are now, where we're talking about the 1% and how just a select number of people earn more money in 1 month than most of us will earn in a lifetime. And so it begs the question, how do we get here? How do we, in 12,000 years, how do we get from an egalitarian lifestyle that was somewhat like what the Kongsan lived in to where we are now in our society, where we're constantly dealing with these wealth gaps? Well, archaeologists working in various parts of the world and looking at societies that existed at many different time periods have compiled a lot of information, and we have a lot to say here. And so here I'm going to briefly summarize a lot of different works. And specifically, we've thought about how inequality has been institutionalized. And what I mean by institutionalization is how inequality becomes an enduring and perhaps taken for granted aspect of society. So thinking about modern debates and the issues that we're arguing about constantly, we have to argue about the middle class, the upper class, lower class. But we take inequality for granted in many cases. To bring up equal relationships, to argue that everyone deserves to earn the same amount of money or have the same status and that we shouldn't have leaders, that is almost inadmissible. Boogeyman, stop talking about that. Go away. You know, we have all these mechanisms for stopping those kinds of conversations. Whereas for the Kongsan, our form of life, these unequal relationships for them are just ludicrous, or would have been ludicrous. How can you let one person accumulate so much wealth and boss you around? You need to take them down a peg. And one of the ways that this happens is through a combination of factors. How we get from the San to these unequal relationships that could be taken for granted is through a combination of ideology, economy, and warfare. So ideology, referring to the use of ideas to legitimate some kind of status quo. So among the Kongsan, you have an ideology of equality, where they expect everyone to be equal and they don't want anybody getting too full of themselves. And if they do, well, they bring them down a peg. They have this mentality of that's how we live, that's our way of life. Versus in our society, we take for granted that there should be certain people who earn more than others. Well, at least many of us do, not everyone, but many of us take for granted that there is a leader in our community. We may argue about the president, who it should be and shouldn't be, but most people don't argue whether or not communities should have leadership. Whereas among the Kongsan, no one can tell anyone else what to do. They can suggest, they can try to persuade, but if one person gives another person an order in Kong society, they'll probably just brush him off and walk away. And then there's the issue of economy. So thinking about the world of things, production, exchange, and value. So obviously, inequality has to do with distributions of things that have value and the exchange of those valuables and their production. Then lastly is the use of force, so the military. So different societies in the past have used a combination of these factors to generate and maintain these wealth gaps, these differences in status and power. And for today's talk, I'm going to focus on what I think is most relevant for today, which is the relationship between warfare and socioeconomic inequality. I study the ancient Maya, which is a culture that continues to exist today, and their ancestors, the ancestors of the contemporary Maya, built these massive cities in the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Honduras. So if you look at the map on the left, the green generally represents the area that has been the ancestral homelands of the Maya, although today they live all over the world. In fact, I know plenty of Maya peoples who live in the city of Chicago right now. And in the past, Maya societies developed hierarchical systems. So they had kings, they had elites, they had differences in wealth and power, and you had status distinctions clearly between elites and commoners. And they built massive monuments dedicated toward the kings. And so the jade mask that you see on there, that was buried with King Pakal from Palenque. And given that you see these clear status distinctions, and what we know about Maya society as well is that warfare was an important part of being an elite and a ruler. We see strong connections with kingship, engaging in warfare, and also these massive displays of wealth, both in terms of what you wore on your body and the creation of monuments, such as the Temple of Chichen Itza that you see up here. So how did this happen in Maya society? Because we can see some parallels here between them and us, in that there are differences in status and wealth gaps, but then it wasn't always the case. And here we can look back and see how that happened among this particular group. And the way I've done this is by doing research in the Mensabac region of Chiapas, Mexico. And Mensabac is part of a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and home to La Candona and Saltal Maya. And so you can see some of my colleagues here on the screen. We do collaborative research in order to investigate many of the sites that are located along the lake shore here. So you can see the pretty lake, and there are many archaeological sites that would be visible if they weren't all covered up in the rainforest. And so working here, I've asked the fundamental question in terms of, does warfare play a causal role in the institutionalization of socioeconomic inequality? And we found an interesting pattern so far in the region. So what you're looking at here is the site of Noku. And the image here was generated via laser mapping from an airplane. So we fired lasers from an airplane and mapped out the entire Mensabac region, and the bumps that you see toward the center of the screen, all those little bumps are mounds and the remnants of a once heavily populated ancient site called Noku. And the site of Noku was occupied from about 400 BC to about AD 200. And what's interesting here is that through excavations of households, so the remains of where people actually lived, we have found limited differences in exotic or high status items. So when we looked at the quantity and quality of artifacts that were coming out of the different households, there's no major differences. Everyone seems to have had the same amount of access to these goods. So we're not seeing the wealth gaps. We're also not seeing evidence of fortifications. So it seems like there's no real concern with warfare. And then, after about AD 200, Noku and much of the Mensabac region is largely depopulated. And so for the next 1,000 years, we see low population levels, perhaps some evidence of people living at the site of Ixtabay, which is the red star on the map, but that evidence is iffy. And it's really only till about AD 1200 that all of a sudden we see a massive reoccupation of the region. There's population growth and settlement expansion. So now we have people living at Cibatna, La Punta, all around the lake. And the people who came back lived in hierarchical societies. So we see differences in terms of elite and commoners. We see wealth differences as well. So we see differences in exotic and high status items such as jade, metal, and marine shell. The elites have more of this, the commoners have less or none of these items. We also see extensive evidence of fortifications. So the sites of Sunun and Sibat Na and many others in the region contain evidence of walls and other features to create defenses. And so we have a clear juxtaposition here between the first occupants and then the later reoccupation. When the Maya peoples first occupied Menzabak, they lived on the valley floor, and they lived in communities in which there are no major differences in terms of socioeconomic wealth. And there's also no evidence that they were concerned with warfare because we haven't found fortifications. But when people come back, now we see evidence of fortifications and clear differences in terms of status. We see elites and commoners, so that's also tied to power, and also wealth. The elites accumulate more jade, metal, other rare and exotic objects. And so the data here strongly suggests that warfare is tied to the institutionalization of inequality, and that in order to form these socioeconomic wealth gaps, some kind of martial process, whether it's conquest or just maintaining warriors, is helping to perpetuate these differences. And this data finds support from the nearby state of Oaxaca, in which researchers have shown that at the site of Monte Alban, members of that community actually formed or conquered the nearby communities. And in so doing, they formed a centralized government with a bureaucracy to administer the conquered lands. And they also seem to have a monopoly over the legitimate use of force. So a claimed monopoly over the use of warriors and to declare warfare. And what we're seeing here with the Mesoamerican data then is that in order to create these wealth gaps, warfare is playing a strong role. Warrior might, fortifications, this concern with defense ties into the creation of inequality. Which then leads us back to contemporary problems. So let's think about some of these 21st century problems that I brought up at the beginning of my talk. So we know that there are these wealth gaps. We know that the richest 1% seem to be getting richer and richer, and everyone else's economic gains are stagnating or people are getting poorer. And at the same time, we're all paying taxes. And so the poor people who are losing their money, losing their wealth, and the people who aren't gaining anymore are also giving up money to the government, and that government uses that money to pay for the military. And that military, the US military, is way better funded than any other military in this country and in the world. So we exponentially spend more money on troops, army, and marines, bombs, tanks than most of the other nations in the world combined. We spend way more than China and Russia, England, France. And so thinking about this problem and how we have increasing wealth gaps, and then those people who are losing out are also being taxed and their money is going in to pay for the military, you might start to see some parallels between past and present here. It could be that what's going on here is that we're seeing the fundamental relationship between the use of armed forces, the use of the military to support economic inequality, and then economic inequality goes into supporting the military, and you see this cycle forming. Like the insights that we gain from Menzabak and that we gain from Oaxaca. So coming back to our objectives for today and thinking about all that information and tying it together. So objective 1, to describe the processes that led to the growth of inequality in the past. Well, for most of our history, human societies were egalitarian. There were not really major status differences. Hunter-gatherers, generally speaking, lived fairly egalitarian lifestyles. Generally speaking, there are some exceptions here and there, but the general trend is toward equality. And then inequality is institutionalized Somewhere around 12,000 years ago and later on in many different parts of the world, inequality is institutionalized through a combination of ideological, economic, and military power. And then objective 2, explain how archaeological research can address contemporary issues of inequality. Well, the way that we do this is by engaging in a comparative analysis, looking at different case studies, both across space and across time and across cultures. So by looking at the Oaxaca and the Mensabac case studies, we can get a deeper understanding of how wealth gaps formed in the past. And those insights from the past can then help us to reorient and formulate questions about the present. So because we see those relationships between warfare and inequality in Mesoamerica, could it be that the military-industrial complex and the increasing wealth gaps in the US are functioning along similar processes? And that's a question that I'm going to leave you with to ponder for a while. And if you want to talk about it some more, feel free to reach out to me. Email me at cherna5@uic.edu. And as a final note, I just want to say thank you for your time. I look forward to having these conversations with you one day in the future, and I'll see you around.